Priya Vasanthan stood at the edge of a dirt road in Gravel Hollow, Tennessee, staring at a cabin she hadn't thought about in over 30 years. The trees had grown so thick around it that the structure was almost invisible from the road, just a glimpse of weathered wood and a rusted tin roof barely visible through the branches. She had nothing left. Her ex-husband Gerald Thorne had made sure of that. But what was waiting inside that forgotten cabin, buried under decades of dust and silence, was about to turn everything upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Priya almost didn't open it. At 77, she'd grown cautious about envelopes. They rarely brought good news anymore. Since the divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, envelopes had meant legal notices, account closures, insurance cancellations, and one particularly cruel letter from the bank informing her that the joint savings account she and Gerald had built over 41 years of marriage had been drained and closed before she'd even known the proceedings were wrapping up. She set it on the kitchen counter of her small rented room in Clarksville and made herself a cup of tea first. The room was on the second floor of a house owned by a retired schoolteacher named Dolores, who charged her $480 a month and left casseroles outside her door on Fridays. Priya was grateful for both things more than she could say out loud. The room had one window that faced a narrow side yard, a twin bed, a small dresser, and just enough space between them to turn around without bumping into something. After 4 decades in a 4-bedroom house with a wraparound porch in Nashville, the adjustment had been its own quiet kind of grief. She sat down with her tea and opened the envelope. It was from a law office in Cookeville, Tennessee. The letterhead read, Delwood and Associates, Estate and Property Law. The letter was brief, just 3 short paragraphs, and it informed her that the estate of one Emmett Vasanthan, her late uncle, her father's youngest brother, had been settled, and that among the remaining assets was a parcel of land in Cumberland County, Tennessee, recorded under the name of Priya Vasanthan as a gift transfer dated April 3rd, 1987. Priya read that last part twice. She set down her cup. She would have been 40 years old. She and Gerald had already been married for 7 years by then. Uncle Emmett had come to visit them in Nashville that spring, a short visit, just 4 days. He'd been quiet and a little formal the way he always was, brought her a box of Mythi from the Indian grocery he liked in Louisville, sat on their porch and watched the neighborhood with that calm, observant expression he always wore. She remembered him leaving. She remembered hugging him at the door. She did not remember him giving her land. The letter went on to say that the parcel included a small cabin structure and approximately 11.4 acres in the hills east of a town called Gravel Hollow, and that the deed had been properly recorded with Cumberland County, but had never been transferred to her name in any practical sense because Uncle Emmett had continued to pay the property taxes himself every year until his death 6 weeks ago at the age of 94. Priya put the letter down on the bed and looked at the wall for a long moment. Emmett had been paying property taxes on land that belonged to her for 37 years and had never once mentioned it. She thought about calling her daughter Sona, who lived in Atlanta and called every Sunday without fail. Then she thought about what she'd have to explain to get to this part of the story. The divorce, the money, Gerald, all of it. And she decided she needed to understand what she was holding before she said anything to anyone. She read the letter a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into the small drawer of her nightstand next to her reading glasses and a photograph of her parents taken sometime in the late 1960s, before they'd immigrated, before any of this life had even been imagined. The divorce had been Gerald's idea, which was almost funny when she thought about it, because the marriage had largely been Gerald's idea too. They met in 1978 at a community center event in Nashville. He was 32, recently relocated from Cincinnati, working in commercial real estate. She was 31, a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, the daughter of immigrants who had taught her that steadiness and loyalty were the most important things a person could offer. Gerald was charming in the way that certain men are charming, confidently, consistently, in a way that made you feel chosen. She had felt chosen. For a long time, she was glad of it. They built a life together. Gerald's real estate work did well, through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Priya kept the books for his business on top of her regular job for the first decade, then transitioned fully into managing his office when the firm grew large enough to need it. She knew every client, every contract, every property he'd ever bought and sold. She had organized his filing system, handled his correspondence, remembered the names of his clients' wives and children. What she had not done, she understood now, was pay close enough attention to whose name was on what. Gerald had always handled the bank accounts. He said it was because he understood the financial side better, and she had believed him because, for most of their marriage, the money had been there when they needed it. The mortgage was paid. The vacations happened. Sona went to a good college. There was no obvious reason to question the arrangement. The first sign that something was wrong came in 2019, when Priya found a statement for an account she didn't recognize while reorganizing his home office. She asked him about it. He said it was a business account, a new one, nothing she needed to worry about. She had believed that, too. By the time Gerald told her he wanted a divorce, sitting at the kitchen table on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning in February 3 years ago, several things had already happened that she hadn't known about. Money had been moved. Accounts had been restructured. Assets had been placed in arrangements that made them, legally, Gerald's alone. She'd hired a lawyer, a decent one. But decent wasn't enough. Gerald had been planning this. Her lawyer told her carefully for some time. The settlement she received was technically legal and genuinely insufficient. She got a portion of the house proceeds after it sold, which paid off a small amount of debt and left her with just under $22,000. Gerald kept the investment accounts, the business assets, and the lake house in Hendersonville that they'd bought together in 2004 with money she had helped earn. She was 76 years old at the time the divorce finalized. She moved into Dolores's house in Clarksville 4 months later. The morning after the letter arrived, Priya called Delwood & Associates and spoke to a paralegal named Bet who confirmed everything in writing. The land was hers, had been hers since 1987. Uncle Emmett had never built anything on it beyond the original cabin that had been on the property when he purchased it in 1983. He'd use it occasionally as a retreat, Bet said, but in his final years hadn't been able to make the drive. Do you know anything about the property's condition? Priya asked. I really don't, ma'am. You need to see it yourself. The deed is ready for formal transfer into your name whenever you're able to come in. Priya looked out her narrow window at the side yard below. 11.4 acres in the Cumberland foothills. A cabin. A deed with her name on it. She hadn't owned anything with her name on it in 8 months. The feeling that moved through her when she let that sink in was hard to name exactly. It wasn't happiness yet. It was something quieter and more careful than that. The feeling of a door opening in a room you'd forgotten existed. She called Dolores downstairs and asked if she could borrow the car on Thursday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to Gravel Hollow took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Priya left Clarksville before 7 in the morning with Dolores's 2014 Civic, a thermos of chai, and a letter from Delwood & Associates sitting on the passenger seat. She'd printed out directions the night before because she didn't entirely trust her phone's GPS in unfamiliar hill country, and she was glad she did. The last 12 miles involved 2 unmarked turns and a stretch of road that Google Maps seemed to think didn't exist. Cumberland County opened up around her as she drove east. The hills got steeper, the trees denser, the towns smaller and further apart. She passed through a place called Walling that had a gas station, a church, and not much else. Then through a crossroads community with a hand-painted sign that said Chestnut Grove. Then down a long descending road that curved along the edge of a ridge before flattening out into a narrow valley. Gravel Hollow wasn't on most maps. It was less a town than a settled stretch of road. A volunteer fire station, a feed store with a gravel lot, a small post office that shared a building with what appeared to be a hair salon. A handful of houses sat back from the road at various distances, each with its own character, some tidy and painted, others let go in that specific way that happens when a place has been lived in hard for a long time. She stopped at the feed store to ask directions. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his late 60s, heavy set, with a gray beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. His name tag said Roy. Emmett Vasanthan's property, he said, when she described what she was looking for. He said the name slowly, working through the syllables with care. Up on the Delwood Creek Road. You family. He was my uncle. Roy nodded like that explained something. Emmett used to come through here maybe once, twice a year. Quiet fella. Always bought coffee and one of those packaged honey buns. He paused. Sorry for your loss. Thank you. He drew her a small map on the back of a receipt. Left out of the lot, 2 miles, left again at the cedar tree with the reflector nailed to it. Then follow the dirt track until it ends. She found the cedar tree. She found the dirt track. She followed it through a tunnel of overhanging branches for about a 1/4 mile until it opened into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin. Priya turned off the engine and sat for a moment without moving. It was smaller than she'd imagined. 1 story, maybe 600 square feet, built from rough-cut logs that had gone gray with age. The roof was tin, steeply pitched, streaked with rust along every seam. The porch across the front had 2 wooden steps, one of which had rotted through and collapsed inward. Vines had crept up the left side of the structure all the way to the roofline. 1 window on the front had a crack running diagonally across it, and the glass had gone cloudy with age. To most people, it would have looked like something to be torn down. Priya got out of the car and stood in the clearing. The air was different here, cooler, cleaner, carrying the smell of creek water and pine and something loamy underneath it all. The only sounds were birds and the distant movement of water somewhere in the trees. She stood there for a full minute, just breathing. She walked to the porch carefully, testing the good step before putting her weight on it, and tried the front door. It was unlocked. It swung inward with a groan of swollen wood, and the smell that came out was dry and old and closed in, like a room that had been holding its breath. Inside, the cabin was a single main room with a small kitchen area along one wall and a narrow door at the back that led to a bathroom and a small sleeping area. The furniture was minimal, a wooden table with 2 chairs, an iron-frame cot with a bare mattress, a short bookshelf with a dozen paperbacks still on it, their spines faded. A cast-ironwood stove sat in the corner, cold and thick with dust. On the kitchen shelf, there was a coffee can, an old calendar from 2019 still open to March, and a tin box with a latch. Priya crossed the room and picked up the tin box. It was lighter than she expected. She set it on the table and worked the latch, which was stiff but gave way without too much trouble. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a small brass key on a length of twine, and an envelope with her name written on it in her uncle's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. She recognized it immediately. Emmett had always written her name the same way, the piece slightly larger than the rest, the letters evenly spaced, unhurried. Her hands weren't steady as she picked up the envelope. She pulled out the single sheet inside and unfolded it. Priya, it began. I have been meaning to tell you about this place for many years. I kept finding reasons to wait. Forgive an old man for waiting too long. The land is yours. It always was. But there is more to it than the cabin. The key opens the lockbox under the floorboard in the back room. Look at everything in it before you make any decisions. The land you are standing on is worth more than you know. I wanted you to have something that no one could take from you. Not ever. With all my love, Uncle Emmett. Priya read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. She thought about Gerald, about the accounts that had been restructured, the assets arranged just out of her reach, the lake house in Hendersonville with his name alone on the title. Something that no one could take from you. She stood up and walked to the back room. The floorboard wasn't hard to find. 1 plank near the far wall had a small notch cut into its edge, just wide enough to get 2 fingers under. She lifted it. Underneath was a metal lockbox, olive green, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination of age and soil on its surface. She fit the brass key into the lock. It turned. The lockbox held more than she expected. Priya carried it to the main room and set it on the wooden table, pulling one of the chairs around so the light from the front window fell across it. The contents were packed carefully, each item wrapped in a layer of plastic sheeting that had kept the moisture out surprisingly well given how many years everything had been sitting under that floorboard. She lifted things out one at a time. The first was a manila envelope, thick, sealed with a metal clasp. She opened it and found the original deed to the property, 11.4 acres in Cumberland County, Tennessee, recorded April 3rd, 1987, with her full legal name typed across the ownership line. Priya Vasanthan. She stared at her own name for a long moment. There was something strange and clarifying about seeing it on a legal document, on something that declared ownership, after 8 months of feeling like she owned nothing at all. Behind the deed was a second document, a survey map of the property, hand-drawn in precise ink lines with measurements noted along every boundary. The 11.4 acres stretched further than she'd realized from the clearing. The survey showed the cabin and its immediate surroundings as only the front quarter of the land. Behind it, following the line of Delwood Creek, the property extended nearly half a mile into the hills, rising in elevation as it went. She set the survey aside and kept going. There was a stack of letters, rubber-banded together. She counted 14 of them, each one in an envelope addressed to her in Emmett's handwriting. The postmarks ranged from 1989 to 2021. None of them had ever been sent. She opened the oldest one first. Priya, it read, I drove up to the cabin this past weekend. The creek was running high from the spring rain. I thought about calling you, but I didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything. I bought this land because I believed it would matter someday. There is limestone underneath these hills. Good stone, the kind that builders want. I had a man come out and look at it in 1988, and he told me the deposit runs deep. I've been watching what they pay for quarry rights in this county, and it has only gone up. When the time is right, you will understand why I kept this for you. Priya set the letter down. Limestone, quarry rights. She picked up the next letter, dated 1994. I spoke to a geologist this spring. His name is Dr. Calvin Reese out of Cookville. He walked the back portion of your land along the creek and said the deposit is larger than the first estimate. He put it in writing. I have kept his report here with everything else. The market for dimensional limestone in Tennessee has been strong. I don't know when you will need this land, but I believe when you do, it will be ready. She went through the rest of the letters in order. Emmett had been tracking the property for decades with a patience and thoroughness that reminded her, suddenly and sharply, of her father. The same careful attention, the same long view. He'd had the geological survey updated twice, once in 1994 and again in 2009. He'd clipped newspaper articles about limestone quarrying operations in Cumberland and White counties and kept them in a separate folder she found near the bottom of the box. He'd noted comparable land sales in the margins of the articles in his small, precise handwriting. The 2009 geological report was in the box. She found it in its own plastic sleeve, 12 pages long, authored by a firm called Reese and Ballard Geological Services. She couldn't understand most of the technical language, but certain phrases were clear enough. High-grade Tennessee crab, orchard limestone. Estimated surface deposit coverage of 7.2 acres. Depth consistent with commercial quarry viability. Comparable deposits in adjacent counties have supported active quarry operations for 20-plus years. She sat back in a chair and looked at the ceiling. At the very bottom of the lockbox was one final envelope, newer than the others, the paper still white rather than yellowed. Her name on the front in the same careful hand, but the letters slightly less even than they'd been in earlier years. An old man's hand, she thought. She opened it. Priya, if you are reading this, I am gone, and I'm sorry I never found a right moment to sit across from you and explain all of this face to face. I know your life has been difficult lately. Sona called me last year and told me about Gerald. I was angry on your behalf in the way that only old men who love their nieces can be angry, quietly and for a long time. I want you to know that I thought about transferring this land to you sooner. Many times. But I worried Gerald would find a way to include it in your shared assets, and I did not trust him with it. So I kept paying the taxes. I kept it clean. I kept it waiting. The land is yours alone, Priya. It was always yours alone. No one else's name is on it. No one else has any claim to it. Whatever Gerald took from you, he cannot touch this. There's a man named Warren Okafor who works in the Cumberland County Land Records Office. He knew about this property and knew I intended it for you. He is honest, and he will help you understand what you have. Call him before you talk to anyone else. You are stronger than you know. You always were. I just wanted to make sure you had something solid under your feet when you needed it. Oh, my love, always. Uncle Emmett. Priya sat in the quiet of the cabin for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, the creek moved through the trees. A bird called once and went silent. The afternoon light had shifted while she'd been reading, moving off the front window and leaving the room in a softer, cooler shade. She thought about Gerald sitting at the kitchen table that Wednesday morning in February, calm and prepared, telling her he wanted a divorce. She thought about the accounts she hadn't known about, the assets arranged just out of reach, the lake house with his name on it. She thought about the $22,000 that was supposed to represent her half of 41 years. Then she looked at the deed on the table in front of her. Her name, her land, her uncle's 40 years of quiet, careful love sitting in a lockbox under a floorboard, waiting for exactly this moment. She took out her phone and found the number for the Cumberland County Land Records office. She asked for Warren Okafor. Warren Okafor answered on the second ring. His voice was measured and warm, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd spent years dealing with people on difficult days and had learned to be steady for them. He said he'd been expecting her call, that Emmett had mentioned her name to him more than once over the years, and that he was sorry for her loss. Your uncle was a careful man, Warren said. He wanted this done right. I'm sitting in the cabin right now, Priya told him. I found the lockbox, the deed, the geological surveys, his letters. There was a brief pause. Good. That's everything you'll need. When you're ready, come by the office and we'll get the deed formally transferred into your name. After that, I'd strongly recommend you speak with a property attorney before you do anything else with the land. Do you know anyone? I know of Rosalind Beaumont in Nashville. Property rights, land transactions. She's handled quarry rights cases before. I can give you her number. Priya wrote it down on the back of one of Emmett's old envelopes. She drove back to Clarksville that evening with the lockbox on the passenger seat and her mind working through everything quietly. She didn't call Sona yet. She needed a few more days to understand what she was holding before she could explain it to anyone else. She had 3 days of quiet. Then Mitchell Crane called. She didn't know his name at first. The number was local, a Cookeville area code, and she almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. Mrs. Vasanthan? The voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to opening conversations on his own terms. My name is Mitchell Crane. I'm a developer based out of Cookeville. I understand you've recently come into ownership of a parcel of land out in Gravel Hollow. Priya's hand tightened on the phone. How do you know that? Property transfers get recorded publicly, ma'am. It's all a matter of public record. He said it pleasantly, as if the question were slightly naive. I've been watching that parcel for a few years, actually. I knew Emmett Vasanthan. Good man. We spoke once or twice about the possibility of selling. He wasn't interested, but he mentioned he'd left the land to family. She said nothing. She'd learned enough in the past year to know that silence in a conversation like this cost her nothing. I'd love to sit down with you, Mitchell continued. I think I can make you an offer that would be very helpful given your current situation. My current situation? Priya repeated carefully. A fresh transfer of rural property, carrying costs, taxes. These things add up. I could take it off your hands quickly, cleanly, and for a fair price. No auction, no waiting, no complications. He paused. I'm thinking in the range of $90,000 for the full parcel. That's a strong number for undeveloped hill land out there. Priya sat very still. The 2009 geological report was on the table in front of her. She'd been reading it again that morning, looking up terms she didn't recognize. She knew enough now to understand that $90,000 for land with a documented limestone deposit of that scale was not a strong number. It was an insult dressed up in a warm voice. I'll keep that in mind, she said. I can have paperwork drawn up by end of week if you're interested. I said I'll keep it in mind. Thank you for calling. She hung up and wrote his name in the small notebook she'd started keeping. Mitchell Crane, developer, Cookeville, offered $90,000. Declined. She stared at his name for a moment, then added one more line underneath. Knew about the transfer within 72 hours. How? Gerald called 2 days later. She hadn't spoken to him since the divorce finalized. His number still came up under his name on her phone, which she kept meaning to change. She stared at it through 3 full rings, then answered because she thought not knowing what he wanted would bother her more than hearing his voice. Priya. He sounded the same. That particular brand of careful, reasonable calm he'd always used when he wanted something. I heard you came into some property. News travels, she said. I have some interest in land investment these days. Thought maybe we could have a conversation. The audacity of it was almost something she could admire. Almost. Gerald. She kept her voice even. We don't have conversations anymore. We finalized that 8 months ago. This would be strictly business. No. Priya, listen. Rural land like that, you don't know what you're dealing with. You could end up sitting on carrying costs for years with nothing to show for it. I'm offering to help. You've never offered to help me with anything that didn't benefit you more than it benefited me. I'm not interested. She paused. Don't call this number again. She hung up. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from anger, and from something else underneath the anger. The sharp, clarifying recognition of exactly what Gerald had always been, something she'd spent too many years talking herself out of seeing clearly. She picked up her notebook and added a second entry below Mitchell Crane's name. Gerald Thorne. Called 2 days after public transfer. Wants to help. Declined. Then she picked up her phone and called Rosalind Beaumont. Rosalind Beaumont picked up on the 4th ring. Her voice was direct and unhurried, the kind that didn't waste time on pleasantries before it got to the point. She said she had 15 minutes between client calls and asked Priya to give her the short version. Priya gave her the short version. The letter from Delwood and Associates. The cabin. The lockbox. The deed in her name since 1987. The geological surveys. The unsent letters. Mitchell Crane's call. Gerald's call 2 days after that. There was a brief silence on the other end. You said the 2009 survey was done by Reese and Ballard? Yes. I know their work. They're solid. Another pause, shorter this time. Mrs. Vasanthan, I want to be straightforward with you. What you're describing, if the documentation holds up the way it sounds, is not a small matter. Limestone Quarry writes on a documented deposit of that scale in Cumberland County. That's a significant asset. The kind developers watch carefully. Mitchell Crane seemed to know about the transfer within 3 days. That doesn't surprise me. People in that business monitor county records closely. Rural land with documented mineral potential doesn't stay quiet long. Rosalind's tone sharpened slightly. The $90,000 offer is predatory. I want you to understand that clearly. He knew exactly what he was doing. I figured as much. And your ex-husband calling 2 days later. Do you know if he and Crane have any connection? Priya hadn't thought of that. She wrote it down in her notebook. I don't know. Is that possible? Worth finding out. Men like that tend to move in the same circles. Rosalind paused. Can you come to Nashville? I'd like to see the documentation in person before we go any further. They set a meeting for the following Thursday. Priya called Celestine Dupre that same evening. Celestine had been her closest friend for 22 years, since they'd met at a community garden project in Nashville and had discovered they lived 4 streets apart. She was 71, a retired librarian with a sharp memory and a low tolerance for nonsense. And she was one of 3 people Priya had told about the divorce as it was happening, because Celestine was the kind of person you told things to when you needed someone to be honest with you rather than just kind. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Priya finished, there was a moment of quiet. Emmett paid the taxes on that land for 37 years without telling you, Celestine said. Yes, because he didn't trust Gerald. That's what his letter said. Another silence. Smart man. I know. And now Gerald is calling you about it. 2 days after the public transfer. Celestine made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Priya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Did Gerald ever know about Emmett's land? Did it ever come up? Priya thought about it carefully. She went back through years of dinners and conversations and holiday visits, through every time Emmett had come to Nashville, every phone call she could remember having with him while Gerald was in the house. Emmett and Gerald didn't like each other, she said slowly. They were always polite, but there was something between them. A distance. I used to think it was just personality differences. But now I think Emmett saw something I didn't. Yes, Celestine said simply. He did. They talked for another hour. Celestine had a nephew who worked in commercial real estate in Memphis and offered to call him for a general read on limestone quarry valuations in Tennessee. Priya said that would help. Before they hung up, Celestine said one more thing. You remember what you told me when Gerald's lawyer presented that settlement offer? You said you felt like you were standing in a room where all the furniture had been removed while you were sleeping, and you were supposed to pretend it was normal. I remember. You're not in that room anymore. Warren Okafor's office in the Cumberland County Courthouse was small and organized with the particular neatness of someone who genuinely liked paperwork. He was in his mid-50s, slightly built, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and a careful way of moving through his filing system that reminded Priya of a surgeon with instruments. He had Emmett's file already pulled when she arrived. Your uncle came in every few years, Warren said, setting the folder on the desk between them. Always to update his contact information for the tax notices, always to confirm the ownership hadn't been disturbed. He looked at her over his glasses. He was very specific that your name stay on that deed and nothing else change. Did he ever say why? Warren considered the question. He said once that some things need to be protected from the wrong kind of attention until they're ready to be useful. He paused. I think he meant you specifically, not just the land. Priya looked at the folder. Inside was a copy of a 1987 deed, the tax payment records going back decades, a note in Emmett's handwriting clipped to the inside cover. The note said, she will come when she needs to. Help her. Warren, watch her read it. What would you like to do first? Transfer the deed formally into my name, Priya said. Then I have a meeting in Nashville on Thursday with a property attorney. Good. He opened the folder and began pulling the necessary forms. Your uncle chose well. He did, Priya said, in more ways than one. Rosalind Beaumont's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville, the kind of office that communicated competence without trying too hard, bookshelves with actual books on them, a desk that had seen real work, 2 chairs across from it that were comfortable without being soft. Rosalind herself matched the office. She was in her mid-50s, tall, with natural gray threaded through dark hair she wore pulled back. She shook Priya's hand firmly, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and got straight to it. You brought everything? Priya set the lockbox on the desk. Rosalind spent the next 2 hours going through it with the focused attention of someone who charged by the hour and earned every dollar of it. She read the deed first, then the survey map, then both geological reports in sequence. She went through Emmett's letters carefully, not skimming, actually reading. She examined the newspaper clippings with their margin notes. She asked occasional questions, which Priya answered as precisely as she could. When she finished, she set everything back in a lockbox with the same care she'd used handling it and looked across the desk. The deed is clean, she said. Properly recorded, continuously maintained, your name only. Gerald Thorne has no claim to this property. It predates your marriage, it was never jointly held, and the tax records show your uncle's consistent stewardship throughout. No court would find grounds to include this in marital assets, even if someone tried to argue it. Priya exhaled slowly. The geological documentation is the more interesting part. Rosalind tapped the 2009 survey. Reese and Ballard are well regarded. Their assessments hold up. But this report is 17 years old, and the limestone market has moved considerably since then. She opened her laptop and turned it so Priya could see the screen. I pulled comparable transactions this morning. Quarry writes leases on documented limestone deposits in Cumberland and White counties over the past 4 years. The numbers on the screen were not small. A 9-acre parcel with a similar geological profile had sold its quarry rights in 2021 for $1.1 million. Another, slightly smaller, had negotiated a long-term extraction lease in 2023 that guaranteed the landowner $780,000 over 15 years plus royalties per ton extracted. A third transaction, the most recent, involved a parcel of nearly identical acreage to Priya's in the next county over 11 acres, documented limestone deposit, sold outright in early 2024 for $1.4 million. Priya looked at the numbers. Then she looked at Rosalind. Mitchell Crane offered me $90,000, she said. Rosalind's expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes went sharp. Mitchell Crane operates exactly the way you'd expect someone like him to operate. He finds landowners who don't know what they have, moves quickly before they can find out, and offers enough to seem generous without being anywhere near fair value. She closed the laptop. He knew about that limestone. He absolutely knew. How much is my land actually worth? Rosalind was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of someone who understood the weight of the number she was about to say. With an updated geological survey, which I'd recommend commissioning immediately, and with proper representation in any sale or lease negotiation, you're looking at somewhere between $1.10 and $1.6 million for an outright sale of quarry rights. Possibly more if multiple buyers are competing. She paused. If you chose a long-term extraction lease instead, you'd receive less upfront, but potentially more overall across the life of the agreement, along with ongoing royalty income. Priya sat with that for a moment. She thought about the rented room in Clarksville, the $480 a month, the casserole outside her door on Fridays, the $22,000 from the divorce settlement, already reduced by 8 months of rent and living expenses to something closer to $14,000. She thought about Gerald's voice on the phone, calm, helpful, offering to assist her with something he'd spent years making sure she'd never have. What do I do first? She asked. First, we send a formal cease and desist to Mitchell Crane advising him that you are represented by counsel and that any further direct contact constitutes harassment. Rosalind said it matter-of-factly, the way someone describes making coffee. Second, we commission an updated geological survey. I work with a firm in Cookeville, good people, they can have someone out there within 2 weeks. Third, once we have updated numbers, we approach the market properly. And Gerald? Rosalind met her eyes. Gerald has no legal standing here. But if he contacts you again, I want to know about it immediately. Document everything he says. Already started a notebook, Priya said. For the first time since Priya had walked in, Rosalind smiled. It was small and genuine. Good, she said. That's exactly right. On the drive back to Clarksville, Priya called Celestine. Between $1.10 and $1.6 million, she said when Celestine picked up. The updated geological survey took 11 days. Priya drove out to the cabin twice during that period, both times alone, both times staying longer than she'd planned. She swept the floors. She cleared the vines from the left wall with a pair of garden shears she bought at the feed store in Gravel Hollow, where Roy recognized her now and had her coffee order ready before she reached the counter. She fixed the collapsed porch step with 2 planks of lumber and a box of screws, following a tutorial on her phone with the careful attention she used to give to Gerald's filing system. The cabin was beginning to feel less like a discovery and more like a place. She read more of Emmett's unsent letters in the evenings, sitting at the wooden table with a lamp she'd brought from Clarksville. He'd written about the land with a quiet love that had nothing to do with its monetary value. He described the way the creek sounded after heavy rain. He described the particular quality of light in the clearing on October mornings. He described driving up alone on his birthday 3 years in a row because he found the silence there more companionable than most people. She understood that completely. The survey team from Cookeville arrived on a Wednesday morning, 2 geologists with equipment she couldn't name who spent the better part of 2 days walking the back portion of the property along the creek. Their lead geologist, a younger woman named Dr. Aldine Marsh, stopped by the cabin at the end of the second day to give Priya a preliminary read. The 2009 survey underestimated it, Dr. Marsh said, without preamble. The deposit runs deeper than they measured and extends further east than the original boundary. We're looking at closer to 8.4 acres of viable extraction surface rather than 7.2. She paused. This is a significant find, Mrs. Vasanthan. Whoever assessed this in 2009 was working with older equipment. The picture is considerably better than what you have on paper. Priya called Rosalind before Dr. Marsh's truck had cleared the dirt track. The formal report arrived 8 days later. Rosalind called her the morning it came in. Her voice carried the particular energy of someone who had good news and was making herself deliver it steadily rather than all at once. The updated numbers put viable limestone extraction across 8.4 acres at a depth and quality that exceeds the 2009 estimates by a meaningful margin, she said. I've already had 2 calls this week from quarry operations who monitor new survey filings. They move fast in this industry. She paused. I want to approach this as a competitive process. Let interested parties know there are others at the table. That's how you get the real number rather than the first offer. How long will that take? 3 to 4 weeks if we move efficiently. Maybe less. Priya thought about Mitchell Crane's smooth voice on the phone. She thought about Gerald's reasonable calm. She thought about $90,000 dressed up as generosity. Move efficiently, she said. Mitchell Crane called again 10 days into the process, despite the cease and desist. He didn't call Priya directly this time. He called Dolores's landline in Clarksville, which meant he'd done enough digging to find where she was living. Dolores, who had been told exactly who Mitchell Crane was and what he wanted, wrote down his message on a notepad and slid it under Priya's door. Mr. Crane says his offer has been revised upward to $200,000, and he'd appreciate a callback. Priya photographed the note and sent it to Rosalind, who added it to the file she was building and sent Crane's attorney a second letter that was, by Rosalind's description, considerably less polite than the first. Gerald did not call again. Whether that was his own decision or something his attorney had advised, Priya neither knew nor particularly cared. The final negotiation took place over 6 days of back and forth between Rosalind and 3 separate interested parties, 2 regional quarry operations and a larger materials company based out of Knoxville called Harwell Stone Group. Priya was not in the room for most of it, which Rosalind said was by design. You don't want to negotiate emotionally, she told Priya. You want the other side negotiating emotionally while we stay calm. Harwell Stone Group won the negotiation. Their offer was $1.47 million for full quarry rights, with a royalty structure on extracted tonnage that Rosalind estimated would generate an additional $40,000 to $60,000 annually in the early years of operation. Rosalind called Priya on a Thursday afternoon in late October with the final number. Priya was sitting in the cabin when her phone rang, at the wooden table where she'd first opened Emmett's letter, in the same chair, in the same afternoon light. She listened to Rosalind read the number. She thanked her. She set the phone on the table and looked at the room around her. The swept floors, the fixed porch visible through the open front door, the creek moving somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing. Then she picked up her phone again and called Sona in Atlanta. "Mom." Sona answered on the second ring, slightly worried the way she always was when Priya called outside their Sunday schedule. "Is everything okay?" "Everything," Priya said, "is exactly okay. I have something to tell you." The sound Celestine made was not quite a word either, but it carried everything it needed to. The closing paperwork was signed on a Monday morning in Rosalind's office on Charlotte Avenue. Priya wore the blue silk kurta she'd bought for Sona's college graduation 23 years ago and had kept through every move and every difficult year because she couldn't bring herself to let it go. It still fit. She sat across from Rosalind and a representative from Harwell Stone Group named Carl Deming, who was professional and efficient and shook her hand at the end with genuine respect. The check was deposited electronically. Rosalind walked her through every number one final time before they finished. After fees and taxes and Rosalind's commission, which was fair and exactly what they'd agreed on, Priya walked out of that building with $1.31 million cleared and sitting in an account with her name on it. Just her name. She stood on Charlotte Avenue for a moment in the November cold and let that fact arrange itself properly in her mind. Then she walked to the small cafe 2 doors down, ordered chai, sat by the window, and called Celestine. "It's done," she said. Celestine was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Emmett knew." "He knew," Priya agreed. She gave Sona a sum large enough to clear the remainder of her mortgage in Atlanta, which Sona argued against for 20 minutes before accepting with the kind of tearful practicality that made Priya love her even more than usual. And then, in early December, Priya signed a 6-month lease on a small house in Gravel Hollow. The house was a mile from the cabin, on a quiet road with a covered porch that faced east. It had a spare bedroom, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in, and a back room with good north-facing light that Priya had decided, before she'd even finished the walkthrough, would become her workroom. She'd painted when she was young. Watercolors, mostly landscapes and botanical studies, filling sketchbooks through her 20s with the focused pleasure of someone who found the practice genuinely satisfying rather than performative. Gerald had never been dismissive of it exactly. He'd just consistently found other things that needed her attention more urgently. And over the years, the sketchbooks had migrated to a closet shelf, and then to a box in the attic, and then, somewhere in the move, disappeared entirely. She bought new supplies in Nashville on the drive down. Watercolors, 3 brushes, 2 pads of cold-pressed paper, a small folding easel. She spent more than she'd intended and didn't mind at all. Her first painting in Gravel Hollow was of the cabin. She sat on its fixed porch on a cold December morning with the easel propped on the step and painted the clearing, the tree line, the pale winter light coming through the branches above the tin roof. It took her 4 hours, and she thought about Emmett the entire time, about his unsent letters and his quiet decades of care and the specific kind of love that plans for someone's future without needing credit for it. She framed the painting and hung it in the workroom above her easel. In February, 4 months after the closing, Priya drove to the First Cumberland Bank in Cookeville, where the property tax records for her land had been processed for 37 years, and made a donation to their local family emergency fund in Emmett Vasanthan's name. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a small, specific one which felt more like him. She also called Warren Okafor. "I want to do something useful with the cabin," she told him. "Not sell it. Something else. Do you know of families in the county who need temporary housing? People in transition?" Warren was quiet for a moment. "I know of a few situations, yes." "Then let's talk about how to make that work." The cabin became a short-term refuge for 2 families over the following year. A woman leaving a difficult situation with her teenage son, and an elderly man whose house had been damaged by flooding and who needed somewhere to stay while repairs were sorted out. Priya covered the basic costs herself and asked nothing in return. Roy at the feed store told her at some point that people in Gravel Hollow had started referring to it as the Vasanthan place, said with a warmth that indicated the name had come to mean something decent to them. She thought Emmett would have liked that. On a Sunday morning in March, Priya sat on the porch of her rented house in Gravel Hollow with a cup of chai and watched the light come up over the eastern hills. The air was cold still, but carried something underneath the cold, the first suggestion of spring working its way up through the soil. She thought about the Tuesday the envelope had arrived, the small room in Clarksville, the careful way she'd made herself tea before she could bring herself to open it, the 2-hour drive through hill country with the letter on the passenger seat. For anyone sitting with loss right now, or with a particular exhaustion of feeling like someone else's decisions have narrowed your life down to something unrecognizable, Priya's story is worth holding on to. Not because everything works out neatly, which it rarely does, but because of what Emmett understood that the rest of the world missed. He saw that the most durable thing you can give someone is not money itself, but something that exists entirely outside the reach of people who mean them harm. Something with their name on it. Something waiting. Priya thought she had lost everything at 76. What she had actually lost was the weight of a life built around someone who was quietly working against her. Once that weight was gone, once she found what Emmett had kept safe for her, she didn't just recover. She built something new, something that fit her, in a place that had been hers all along without her knowing it. The deer disappeared into the tree line. The wood smoke kept rising. Priya kept drawing. Some gifts arrive exactly when they're supposed to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.